Welcome back to Exploring the Christian Faith. This is the fifth and last video on the book of Genesis, and it's appropriate to talk about the women of Genesis. I wonder if you have a favorite or a woman that you find most intriguing in the book of Genesis. Might it be Eve or Sarah or Hagar or Lot's wife or Lot's daughters or Rebecca, Rachel, Dinah, Tamar, and how so? I want to talk to you about three of my favorite women in Genesis, but before we do so, I wonder if we could draw some comparisons between women today and women back then. I think the comparisons and contrasts are fairly obvious and stark. In ancient Canaan, women have no right to ownership. Only men can possess stuff. They have herds and cattle and Mercedes-Benzes and land. They have no other rights. They are defined very importantly through childbearing, and in particular, bearing sons. They also have very little romantic freedom. Their desire is tied and stabilized by their husbands. And they live in a very strict patriarchal culture. Compare that today. Women own cars and land and houses. They have rights. They are not defined solely through childbearing, and they have the freedom to date, the freedom to find their own romantic partners. They're independent, and they live in a culture of perhaps moderate patriarchy. So given all of that, given the stark contrast between the ancient world in which Genesis is written and our world, I wonder what you thought about some of the women in Genesis. So let's look at Hagar. We know that she's one of the Egyptian slaves that Abraham brings from Egypt. So she's a foreigner living in Canaan in the midst of Abraham's house. We know that she is just given as basically as a womb, as a surrogate mother to Sarah. We don't have no idea if she wants to do that, whether she is romantically interested in Abraham. And she's abused by Sarah. On two occasions, first time when she's pregnant, second time when after Ishmael is born, two occasions she's out in the wilderness and God pays attention to her. It's not just the way that God pays attention to her and rescues her life, but it's the particular form of address. The angel tells her in Genesis 16 that the Lord has heard your cry of distress. That's exactly the same expression used in Exodus that marks the way in which God has heard the cries of distress of the Hebrew slaves now in Egyptian captivity. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that ironic? The second time, of course, is in Genesis 22, when this time she has been exiled by Abraham and Sarah together. And again, God hears the cries of the boy of Ishmael. And we encounter here a God that sees and a God that hears across ethnic lines, across relationships of power. A God who is particularly tuned into the life of the abused, to the life of the vulnerable, to the life of the excluded, to the life of the exiled. How about Leah? Here's a woman who desperately wants to be loved, but cannot find it. Cannot find it even in Jacob, her husband. She's always second fiddle to Rachel's beauty, always in Rachel's shadow. But we know that God pays attention. And then look at her response. Reading from Genesis 29, the Message translation. When God realized that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. I love that. In a culture that put women on the map through their fertility, here's God saying, I know, Leah, that you're second fiddle, and I'm going to put you on the map. But Rachel was barren. Leah became pregnant and had a son. She named him Reuben. Look, Look, it's almost like she's saying, look, Jacob, it's a boy. This is a sign, she said, that God has seen my misery and a sign that now my husband will love me. You can see that desire to connect, the desire to be appreciated by her husband. She became pregnant again, had another son. God heard, she said, that I was unloved. So she gave me the son also. She named this one Simeon. God heard. She became pregnant yet again, another son. She said, now my husband will connect with me. What's the implication? 3 sons. And Jacob has still not connected in a loving way with her. They've had kids, but they haven't had love yet. She became pregnant the final time and had a 4th son. She said, this time I'll praise God. She named him Judah, praise God. Then she stopped having children. Of course, she continues to have children. But what strikes me is that this woman is so desperate for love, yet she keeps invoking the name of God in the naming of her sons. Is it despair? Is it faith and hope? Is it maybe a combination of both? Even more interesting is that she is continuing the line of Genesis where the power of naming is actually the power of God. Remember Adam naming all the animals in the Garden of Eden? Leah is exercising exactly the same power of naming. Remember the power of naming in Genesis 1 when God speaks things into existence through words? Leah is exercising the divine power of naming, bringing out of the chaos of her life, out of the chaos of her own loneliness and unconnectedness and lovelessness, out of the chaos of all of that. She's bringing order to the power of naming. So how does God relate to the women of Genesis? Well, he notices Sarai's laughter. He notices Hagar's destitution and abuse. He notices Leah's desperate desire for affection and later on Rachel's barrenness. So God is not just the men's therapist, he also becomes the therapist of all the women in Genesis. The women in Genesis possess the power of naming. They are not just included in God's story, but they are often innovators and trailblazers. Think about Tamar, that incredible chapter 38 of Genesis, which is kind of a break in the life of Joseph. It's almost like a commercial break, right? Tamar, who's married to two of Judah's sons, so she desperately wants to be part of Jacob's line through Judah, yet these guys, her husbands, don't want to give her any sons, don't want to put her on the map. So what's she going to do? Well, first of all, the sons die, so now she's left barren without kids. So what's she going to do? She's going to take matters into her own hands. She's going to seduce, she's going to play the prostitute, she's going to seduce Judah to get her son through that Jacobian family, through Jacob's family. She notices there's something special about that family. She wants to be part of it. I say, what? Someone who plays the prostitute has a child in that kind of way is included in the Bible? Yes. And even more than that, out of Tamar comes an ancestor that will be the great-great-grandfather of King David. And more than that, you read Matthew 1, verse 3, and you find Tamar mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. When God tells his own story, he is not ashamed to name Tamar as part of that story, as part of his own history. Tamar is only one of only 4 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. But it's not Rachel, it's not Sarai, it's Tamar that makes the cut. So why is God doing this? Why is God telling the genealogy in this way? What's the text trying to tell us? Perhaps what God's trying to tell us is that there's grace, and there's grace, and there's grace despite the brokenness. Thanks.